and having no nation of their own. And then the other thing that happened is that when Luke tells the same story, he adds in a couple of words in which he says, and all the other trees. When God does something in Israel, he determines to do something in all the other trees. And the other trees, when we look at the New Testament and we see what's God doing in the other nations of the world, there are two promises of things that he's going to do in the other nations of the world at the end time. One is that he is going to make sure that the gospel is preached to every nation as a sign before the end comes. And the second thing he promised is he'll pour out his Spirit on all flesh, all nations. And so we traced every time that God did something in the land of Israel, he also did something significant to further world evangelism and to further the movement of the Holy Spirit. And that's where we got to yesterday. Now, I told you that from the 69th to the 70th week that there was a pause button. And that the only way we're going to know when that pause button is released is when that we get a new temple. Because obviously you can't have this temple sacrifice unless you have a temple. Temple's destroyed at the end of the 69th week, so we got to have the temple rebuilt in time for the 70th week. And so lesson number 7, page 31, deals with the temple, a major piece of the puzzle. And let me read it from the book. David says, "One thing have I desired of the Lord that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple." That's Psalm 27:4. Interestingly enough, there wasn't any temple, page 133. Interestingly enough, there was no temple at the time that David said that. Remember, David wanted to build a temple. God said, "You're not building it. Your son's going to build it." But I find it fascinating to read the Psalms and to look in all the Psalms and see all the statements about that David makes about the sanctuary. How beautiful the sanctuary is and all that. You say, well, wait a minute. There wasn't any sanctuary when you were saying that. But he lived prophetically. He lived as a visionary. I remember Andrew talking about before, not the buildings that we are just now completing, but the building on Elkton Street. I remember him talking about when he went there that he would walk around and go to places where that he knows there's going to be a door and walk through the door rather than to walk through a place where he knows there's going to be a wall. Because he says, there's not a wall there yet, but my vision is that there's a wall here, and so I'm not going to walk through a place where that there's a wall that I can't walk through. And then he says, and he would go to places where he knows that the stairwell's going to be, and he would act like he's walking up the steps to get to the next spot because there's not steps there now, but there are going to be steps. And David was just like that. David was saying, whoa, this temple is so significant, and it's such a vision from God that I'm already worshiping in there, even though it's not built yet. Whew, I love that. Okay, and then the world is like a great eye. The ocean surrounding the world is the white of the eye. The black of the world is the black is the world itself. The pupil is Jerusalem, and the image inside the pupil is the sanctuary. And the word image there could also be translated to say the sparkle in the eyeball is the temple of God. The Jews loved the temple. They knew it was the most significant, most important part of what God had done for them. And it is a major puzzle piece to put the whole rest of the puzzle together. Solomon built the temple in just about 1000 BC. It was 959 BC, but basically at 1000 BC. And he made one of the most extravagant architectural ventures that you've ever thought of in the world. It took 7.5 years, and it was carried out on such a grand scale that he used 30,000 laborers to build the building. He employed 70,000 burden bearers, people that just carried the materials around, 80,000 stone cutters, plus 3,300 captains over the work. I mean, you're looking at like 200,000 people building that building. And Genus Finning Dake. Some of you may know the Dake Annotated Bible. Some people call it the Dake's Anointed Bible, but annotated is actually what it is. But Dake's Annotated Bible, which was written in 1963, Genus Finning Dake calculated at the current prices in 1963, looking at all of the materials and everything that was used to build the temple, he estimated that the temple would have cost $174 billion with a B, U.S. dollars. And then if you recognize that the U.S. dollar, it takes like 1.2 or 1.3 of Canadian dollars, and you multiply that out. And then you think about, that was 1963. And this is 2018, and you look at the inflation and the appreciation and everything between 60-something years ago, and you bring that into today, and wow, can you imagine? Solomon's temple was probably the most incredible building that has ever existed on planet Earth. However, it was destroyed. The Babylonians came, and they made 2 invasions through Israel, and one time they didn't destroy the temple, they just robbed everything out of it, and another time they came back and destroyed it. But before then, all during the history of Israel, there was a continual war back and forth between the northern and the southern kingdom, and between some of the Assyrians and the Syrians and Israel, and they plundered the temple time and time again. They took the gold out of the temple and used it to pay off war debts and different things, and to pay tribute so that they wouldn't get attacked. And there was always a constant struggle with the treasures of the temple, because it was the treasury. It was the most valuable thing in the nation of Israel. However, God continually sent prophets to say to the people, don't trust in the temple. When Solomon built the temple, he had the most elaborate dedication you could ever imagine, with thousands of animals sacrificed, and all kinds of prayers and everything, and the glory filled the temple to where the people couldn't walk into it. It was incredible. But he prayed that day. He says, God, when we turn against you, and when we sin, and when we are captive, and when we have troubles, help us to always remember to look toward this temple and pray, and you'd hear us. And so they made it a central focus of their worship. But God continually sent prophets and said, this temple is not the thing. He says, if your hearts aren't right, it doesn't matter if you have this elaborate building or not. It's a matter of your heart. It's a matter of your obedience. Well, the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. And then, eventually, God sent Zerubbabel and Yeshua and some of the others to come and to rebuild the temple. And God gave Cyrus, the king of Persia, a vision or a mandate to allow the people to go back and to rebuild the temple. And so they rebuilt the temple. When the temple was rededicated, the Bible says that there was a sound that was heard for miles away because some of the people remembered the previous temple, and they were groaning and moaning because that the present temple did not qualify to replace the previous temple. The other people who were not old enough to remember the first temple, they were celebrating the fact that they had a temple at all. But it says that the sound that rose up between the people who were groaning and the people who were rejoicing was heard for miles away. Now, I told you before about Antiochus Epiphanes. After the temple was rebuilt, and then we have the period in which the Greeks began to rule, Antiochus Epiphanes wanted the temple in Jerusalem as a place for him to be worshipped. Because remember I told you his name Epiphanes, his name was Antiochus, and he chose the title Epiphanes, which is essentially the same as the title we have for Jesus. It said that he is Emmanuel, God with us. And he wanted to be recognized as God. And he says the most elaborate building in the world is this temple in Jerusalem, even though it was the second temple. And so he went through and conquered the temple and sacrificed pigs and proclaimed himself God in the temple and everything. And in the book of Maccabees, which is in the Apocrypha, the part that the Catholics have that the Protestants don't have, we don't consider it to be a divinely inspired version of the Bible, but it does have a lot of good history, and it shows us the things that happened during that period of time. It tells us about how the people reconquered the temple and took it back and rededicated the temple. One of the amazing stories is the origin of the Jewish holiday Hanukkah. And we have no idea how totally historical it is. It could just be legendary. But the story is that when they captured the temple back and they cleansed it and purified all of the things that were there and were going to rededicate it. The menorah inside of the holy place is supposed to be a lampstand, a candle stand, that never goes out. It's the eternal flame. And so they had enough oil for 1 day's worth of burning in the candle stand. However, they knew that the process for making the special oil, it wasn't just ordinary oil, it had to go through a lot of processes to be oil that could be used in the menorah. They knew it was going to take them a week to get that oil prepared and ready to burn. And so they were perplexed. Shall we start the menorah and let it go out after 1 day? Or shall we wait a week and then relight the menorah, and then it will never go out again? It'll be the eternal flame. Finally, they decided, we are going to act in faith, and we're going to go ahead and use the little bit of oil we have and use what's in our hand, and we're going to start the menorah, light the menorah. And they did. Wow. Miraculously, the oil that was in the menorah continued to burn, continued to burn, continued to burn, and never went out for 8 days until that eventually the new oil was ready, and that was the beginning of the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. And that's the reason that the Jews only have 8 candles when we have to have, as Christians, thousands of lights on all of our trees and all over our houses. But it's the holiday in which they celebrate the light that never went out. And we have a light that never goes out. Amen? God bless you. Let's take a little break, and we'll be right back. After these messages, we'll be right back. on. All right. So anyway, we were talking about Antiochus Epiphanes and taking over the temple and then it being restored. And then next came the Romans. Okay. During the Roman period, the ruler in Israel was Herod. King Herod, as we've already mentioned, was really put in power and held in power by the Romans. And he was always afraid of what that the Jews might do to him, because that he was really, even though, well, he was an Edomite, so but that makes him, a descendant of Abraham, but not through Ishmael. Not through Isaac. So anyway, so he is he's really always afraid. He's always looking over his shoulder to see who's walking behind him, and he is always trying to do things to curry more and more Roman favor, more and more Roman protection for himself and for his rule in the kingdom. He built the city of Tiberias. And who knows Tiberias? Tiberias was the Roman emperor. So he built this elaborate city on the Sea of Galilee, beautiful city, but it was again dedicated to the Roman emperor. He built the magnificent harbor and the entire city with amphitheaters and all sorts of everything that was the most modern thing they had in the first century down on the Mediterranean Sea, and named it Caesarea. And of course, what does that mean? Caesar's place, right? So everything he built, he was a great builder and a great architect, and really enhanced the nation of Israel. But everything he was doing was always currying more and more favor and more protection from the Romans. Well, one of the great ventures that he went out on was to remodel the temple. And remember, Solomon's temple was magnificent, probably the most magnificent building that's ever been built in the world. It was destroyed by the Babylonians, and then it was rebuilt. And today in Israeli history, if you are talking to somebody about the history of Israel, they'll say, well, this happened during the first temple period, and this happened during the second temple period. They divide their history by the temples. I told you, it's a key factor here. So anyway, he says that Herod rebuilt the temple because that it was not anything up to the par of the temple that Solomon built. But you got to know that since he built Tiberias, and since he built Caesarea, and since he built everything else in favor of the Romans, that he's got to have an element going here when he's rebuilding the temple too, right? So, the temple was built on top of the Temple Mount. So you have a mountain, you have a peak, and the temple was built on top of the peak. Herod went around the mountain, built a huge retaining wall, and filled it in and turned the peak into a plateau. So that now there's a massive area of space around what was the actual temple site. The entire plateau, instead of just the peak, now becomes the temple. You may remember that the temple had the Holy of Holies, and only the high priest could go there, and only once a year. Then they had the holy place where the priest could go. And then they had the outer court where the people could be, and then outside was what was called the court of the Gentiles. Gentiles could come into the outer court, to the outside place, but they couldn't enter into the temple itself. In fact, there were signs 18 inches high all around the temple saying this far and no further, and the Gentiles couldn't go there. So when Herod turned the peak into a plateau, what he was doing was increasing the space where the Gentiles could go. And so he increased the court of the Gentiles massively and made place for the Romans to be. And the Romans even were allowed to build what's called Antonia fortress there. And it was a fortress that overlooked the temple. You may remember in the book of Acts when Paul was arrested, that it says that they were taking him up the stairs. And that was the stairway that went right from the temple grounds right into the Roman fortress of Antonia. So Herod, even though he was building a magnificent building for the Jews, he was always keeping in mind the Romans. And he built a viewing gallery so that the Romans could go up in the viewing gallery and they could actually see what was going on in the temple better than the Jews could. Because if you're on ground level, you got everybody's head in front of you. You can't see. But if you're up in the balcony, you could see what's going on. And so he was always doing things that were pro-Roman in everything that he did. The significance of that is that when Jesus came and cleansed the temple, do you think that they were actually selling animals on the inside of the temple? They were selling animals in the court of the Gentiles. Do you think they were actually changing money inside the actual temple building itself? They were changing money in the court of the Gentiles. So when Jesus came and he kicked everybody out, and before that he did something else. It said that he refused for anybody to be able to carry a burden through the temple. Now, do you think people were actually walking through the middle of the temple building itself, carrying bags and carrying things on their shoulders and on their heads? No. They were going through the court of the Gentiles because when it used to be a peak, the people could walk easily around the mountain. When he turned it into a plateau, now it's a long journey to go around. And so if you had a business over here and a house over here, before you just walked around the mountain, but now you got a plateau, so you just go up and walk across the edge of the temple courtyard, back down to the other gate on the other side. And so they were walking through the court of the Gentiles. Jesus came and he refused for people to carry anything through the temple, and he cleansed the temple and kicked out the money changers, kicked out the sellers of the animals, and said, "You have turned my house into a den of thieves, but it is supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations." He said, even in the Old Testament prophecy, it is a house of prayer for all nations. It's not just a house of prayer for the Jews. And he said, look at this. Look, Herod made this huge area, and it's just as much the temple as the inside part is, because that my plan is for all the nations, not just for the Jews. Remember, God raised up the Jews because that they were the light to the Gentiles. And God says, I am going to bless Abraham because you will be a blessing to all the families of the earth, right? Okay, so anyway, so Herod built this huge temple, and then it was destroyed by the Romans. Interestingly enough, it was destroyed on the 9th of Av, which is exactly the same. Av is one of the months in the Jewish calendar. on the 9th day of the month of Av. Interestingly enough, that was exactly the same day, historically, that the Babylonians burned the temple back in 586 BC. The same day, same month, same day that the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, it was again destroyed by the Romans. And when the Romans took the city and destroyed the temple, and then they expelled the people out of the land, and they forbade the Jews to come back. Eventually, there was an uprising led by a man named I knew it just a minute ago. I was going to say it. Aqaba. Anyway, so he was no, not Aqaba. It was. I'll think of it in a minute when I'm not trying to think of it. But at any rate, but his name meant the star, and he was rising up as a star to try to reestablish the people of Israel and to reestablish the kingdom of Israel. And so the Romans said, we are not going to allow anything to ever happen again. And so that's when they expelled the people. Bar Kokhba was his name. Anyway, and they expelled the people, and they actually, remember one of the Old Testament prophets said that the Jerusalem would be plowed like a plowed field. And they actually plowed the entire city down and knocked down all the buildings and plowed everything out like a plowed field, and then rebuilt the city as a pagan city dedicated to one of the Roman gods. When everything was destroyed, there were, of course, a lot of things that were still too big to destroy. And one of the things that was too big to destroy was the wall that Herod had built around the temple, because it was massive stones. In fact, some of the stones are like as big as this room, just one stone. There is no way that anybody has ever figured out how they moved them and how they piled them one on top of the other. But they were too big to move. But they were not the temple itself. This was just the retaining wall that was built around the Temple Mount, so that they could hold the dirt in to build the platform upon which the temple was going to be rebuilt. And that is what remains today as what we call the Western Wall, or many people call the Wailing Wall. And when you go to Jerusalem today, and you go there, and people think, oh, I'm at the temple. Well, no, you're not at the temple. You are at the wall that surrounded the Temple Mount. And actually, there is a sign there that still says that the Jews, no devout Jew can go beyond this point, because it's forbidden for anybody other than the high priest to go to the Holy of Holies, right? And if you get up on top of the mountain and everything has been plowed down and you don't know where the Holy of Holies is, you might step on a place where you're not supposed to be, because you might step into the Holy of Holies. And so the devout Jews, the rabbi over Jerusalem, forbids devout Jews from going into the Temple Mount, just to protect them from possibly stepping on the Holy of Holies. Of course, everybody says, "Oh, well, we know where the Holy of Holies is. There's the Dome of the Rock there now, the Muslim mosque." But actually, that's not the case, because it was said in the writings of the historians. It says, when you're standing on the Mount of Olives, you can look through the eastern gate and you look directly into the front door of the temple. if you're standing on the Mount of Olives and you look to the eastern gate, which is now walled up so you can't see through it. But anyway, if you look to the eastern gate, you are not going to be looking at all at the Dome of the Rock. You're going to be looking at a place that's called the Shrine of the Spirit. And it's interesting to me that when you walk on top of Temple Mount, you're walking on top of paving stone everywhere, except there's one little spot where it's not paving stone. There's one little spot where that there is actual bedrock. And would you like to guess where that is? It's in the Shrine of the Spirit. And my guess, and some other archaeologists' guess, is that the Shrine of the Spirit was actually where the Holy of Holies was. The point being, if we ever get to the place, which we will, remember I told you that there's a 7-year period of prosperity that the Jews will have, and that the first 3.5 years are going to be a time of peace, and that during that time that they are going to, as my guess, rebuild the temple, because at the end of that time is when that the Antichrist will break his treaty with the people of Israel, and then he'll stop the oblations and stop the sacrifice. And so he's got, if he's going to stop the sacrifices have to be going. If the sacrifice is going, there has to be a temple. So when are we going to rebuild the temple? During the first 3.5 years, when they have all this prosperity. Okay, so when they rebuild the temple, it is possible to rebuild the temple without tearing down the Dome of the Rock, because there are two separate locations. Of course, at that point, they could tear down the Dome of the Rock if they want to, because they are in total control and their enemies have been decimated. But even if they wanted to leave the Dome of the Rock, they wouldn't have to tear it down, if indeed the Shrine of the Spirit is the place where the Holy of Holies actually stood. So, we don't know, but all that stuff is going to be filled out eventually. Now, I have to tell you a story. A buddy of mine and I had been studying a lot about the temple and all this sort of thing. And we had heard that there was a group of people in Israel who were planning to rebuild the temple. And we kept investigating and researching. This was many years ago. And we kept investigating and researching and trying to find out how to locate them, who they were, how to find them. So we were in Israel. And we went into the old city. We found a little address somewhere in some piece of correspondence somewhere. We went into the old city, and we kept walking around and asking people and looking until finally somebody showed us where that address was. And when we got there, we met the people. And we said, "Are you the people that are trying to rebuild the temple? We've heard that there's a group here doing that." And they ushered us into their back room. And they said, "We believe that God has commissioned us to establish and to remake all the instruments that are going to be used in the temple. You know, the temple, they have to have the vessels to catch the blood when they make the sacrifices. They have to have the shovels to take the ashes out of the altar. They have to have the Urim and the Thummim, and they have to have the lots that are cast on the Day of Atonement to know which one of the goats is going to be sacrificed and which one's going to be the scapegoat taken into the wilderness. And they said, "We feel like God has given us that commission." And they had been doing all the research through the Old Testament and through the Mishnah and everything, and trying to find all the information they could on exactly how everything was made. And they had, I got to hold the mitre that's going to be on the high priest's head that's going to say "Holiness unto the Lord," and I got to hold the dice that's going to tell which one's going to be the scapegoat. And incredible experience. anyway, and so they have all of that. So I said, so you're training the priest and stuff. Oh, no. There's another group that's doing that. And they said, there's a yeshiva here in Jerusalem where that the people feel like God has called them to train up the priests so that they can know how to do all the sacrifices. And they said, and there's another group that they feel like God has called them to actually build the temple building. And they are doing all the same research like we're doing to make sure that we know all the every measurement and every jot and tittle about that, and start collecting the material. And I said, so you're all working together? No, we don't work together. We don't have any association with one another. And I said, duh. And they said, but it's like this, sir. He says, when Messiah comes, we will all have done our little job. And when Messiah comes, then he will bring us all together. And so I said, but now talk about the people who are going to be the priest. The Jews have been scattered all through the world, all through these 1900 years. And how do you know who is really going to be in the priestly line? And they said, well, there's several things. If your name is Cohen, that means priest. And so if your name is Cohen, then you probably are in the priestly line. If your name is Levi, then you're probably in the priestly line. But you know what we decided? They decided that just train anybody that wants to come. And when Messiah comes, he'll pick the ones that can be the real priests, because Messiah will know. But now since then, we've discovered DNA. And I remember, is it Gnome or whatever you call it, where you do the DNA analysis? Anyway, there was, I think it was Life magazine, an article a number of years ago in which that they were first starting to do this kind of research. And the amazing thing is that one of the first 2 or 3 people that they did this ancestral family history on was tracing Hebrew rabbis back to the 1st century. And I have kicked myself 1,000 times for never saving that article. I thought, why in the world did I not think about archiving that, as documentation? But the whole idea is that God has given us the technology today, the scientific ability today, to really determine if somebody really could go back to the ancient priesthood in Israel and be a legitimate heir of a person to stand up in the temple and to make the sacrifices. So, anyway, so that was one of the most amazing discoveries that I've ever made in my life, to find these people and talk to them. So I go back and I talk to the tour guides that take tours through the land of Israel. The Israeli tour guides that are paid by the Israeli government and licensed by the U.S. government to lead these tours. So I went back and I talked to them. I says, "Are you aware of these people over there?" And they said, "No." So I told them how to find them. And when you go to Israel today, they will take you as part of the tour to the Temple Institute, and you'll get to see those people. And I can't guarantee that I'm the first person that ever introduced the Israeli tourist department to them, but I know I'm one of the first. But now it can actually be part of your tour, to where you go and you see that. Now the amazing thing, though, was this. No matter when Israel is rebuilt, the temple in Israel, temple in Jerusalem is rebuilt, it doesn't matter, because there's still going to be just leaves. The only fruit that anybody will ever eat is still from the gospel of Jesus Christ that you and I are commissioned to share. And when we look at all these covenants, we look at the covenant with Abraham, and we look at the covenant with David, it still comes down to the first verse in the New Testament. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the son of Abraham, the son of David. It is always the fulfillment in Jesus Christ. There was World War I that gave us the opportunity to take the Ottoman Turkish land and set it free for the people of Israel to come home. It was World War II that made it possible and made it attractive for the Israeli people, the Jewish people, to come back home. There's still another Holocaust coming. There's still another Battle of Armageddon. There's still another horror that's coming. And all that will pave the way for Jesus Christ to come and to sit on the throne in Jerusalem and to rule the world. But it says that when that happens, that there will be a host that are on the horses with him. You and I are still invited to be part of that picture. And all God's people said, Amen. All righty. I haven't seen the test that you are going to have, but I have a sample test that somewhat parallels what you're going to be tested on. And so let me just ask you, the Jewish people bears the stigma of having its name specifically coined into the word of hate and animosity. Does anybody know what that word is? Anti-Semitism. The yearly toll of anti-Semitic discrimination acts is consistently how much multiplied over those that are against blacks. This is a statistic that comes out of the USA. Not 100. Double, yes. According to legend, Abraham's father manufactured what for sale? Idols. Abraham called God by the Hebrew word El Shaddai, which means the God of the mountain. Okay. Do you know the 7 points that were part of Abraham's covenant? Yes. Some people say no, some people say yes. I will show you a land, I will make you a great nation, I will make your name great, I'll bless those who bless you, I'll curse those who curse you, and I will make your offspring, I'll give you this land forever, and I'll make your offspring as numerable, uncountable as the dust of the earth. Okay, what modern nations occupy Abraham's promised land? Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Egypt and Jordan. When Abraham sent his servant to find a bride for Isaac, what was the stipulation imposed? Yeah, don't take Isaac out of the land. What two blessings did Jacob take from his brother Esau? Physical blessing and the spiritual blessing. What sign did Jacob choose to seal his covenant relationship? Jacob. He said, since you're going to do all this for me, I am going to give you a tithe. Yes. Okay. How did Joseph get a double portion of the inheritance? 2 sons rather than to him individually. Joseph was remembered as a man of faith because asked to take his bones back to the promised land. How long did the Israelites suffer slavery and persecution in Egypt? At the time of the Exodus, the covenant promise was passed to the people of Israel, the children of Israel. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob received the privilege of living in the promised land by heritage. The nation of Israel was to earn this privilege by obedience, keeping the law. Why did God choose to establish a covenant with the Jewish people? Make them an example to the rest of the world, a light to the Gentiles. What does the term diaspora mean? The Jews that are scattered throughout the whole world. Other than Columbus' voyage, what happened in 1492? The Jews were kicked out of Spain, right? Okay, and who were the people of the king? Jewish moneylenders. Who are the new Christians? Jews that pretended to be Christians but practiced Judaism, behind the cover. And what's the origin of the ghetto? The Lateran Council that refused for Jews and Christians to live in the same region. Okay, and then in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, gold represented Babylon, silver represented Medo-Persians, brass represented Greece, and iron represented Rome. The 10 toes of Nebuchadnezzar's image are likely represented in what institution today? The EU, European Economic Community, or the EU. The little horn in the vision was fulfilled in the person of Antiochus Epiphanes. Yes, and eventually the Antichrist. The ultimate fulfillment of this vision of the little horn will be in the Antichrist. Daniel's 70th week is the time of conflict between Israel and the Antichrist. Gog and Magog represents what country? Russia. The second national covenant that defines the Jewish people was established with what person? Abraham, and the second one was David. What king split the kingdom into two? Rehoboam. How many kings from David's lineage ruled Judah? 22. Here it is. Here's the place where it says king. Who was the only non-Davidic king in Judah? Okay, it wasn't a king, it was a queen. So if your test happens to say the word king, don't be confused. It's just a typo. Okay? Athaliah. Who was the ultimate recipient of Abraham and David's covenant? The son of Abraham, the son of David is Jesus. Okay, match these men with the role that they play in Israel's history. Theodore Herzl. He was the founder of the Zionistic movement, remember? Okay, Chaim Weizmann. He was a chemist, and he asked that his payment would be that. Yeah, he asked that the payment for his work would be that the Jews would be given the covenant land. And then General Allenby. He was the military commander that captured the city of Jerusalem. Okay, the Balfour Declaration was replaced with the Burger King Yellow Papers. McDonald White Papers, yes. Hitler's name for the Holocaust was the final solution to the Jewish question. Final solution to the Jewish question. How many Jews died in the Holocaust? 6 million. What are the two reasons that God allowed the horrors of Nazism to exist? The Jews were so disenfranchised that they wanted to go home, and the rest of the nations felt sorry for the Jews enough to give them the land, right? Okay, Israel became an independent state on what day, what year? 1948, May 15th. And I don't think I ever specifically said this statement, but instantly there were 600,000 Jews who were at war with 40 million Arabs. 600,000 versus 40 million. And who do you think won? Jews. Okay. And then here, if this is part of the test, and I don't remember if it is, I have a list of the years that things happened. And even if you don't remember the year, if you just kind of remember the chronology of things, and the first thing happened in the earliest year, and the second thing happened in the next earliest year. Okay? In 1897, that was the first Zionistic Congress. In 1948, that's when Israel became a nation. In 1956, that was the Sinai War. In 1967 would be the Six-Day War, and in 1973 would be the Yom Kippur War. Okay, who destroyed the first temple? The Babylonians. And who rebuilt that temple? No. Zerubbabel, Haggai, Zechariah. Okay. And who refurbished and enlarged that temple? Herod the Great. Who destroyed that temple? The Romans. And who led a revolt against the Romans in AD 135? That was Bar Kokhba. That took me a while to come up with his name a little bit ago. And what is the Wailing Wall? Okay, and the significance of that is that it became a place of prayer because that was the closest place that people could get to the temple. Okay, and they believed that the actual presence, the Shekinah presence of God, resided there. And when the temple is rebuilt, what world figure is going to want to be worshipped there? The Antichrist. Okay, good. So, sounds like everybody's pretty well ready for the test. All right. God bless you. Okay, we have 10 minutes, it looks like to me. It looks like maybe 12 minutes. 6 minutes. 15 minutes. Okay. I have been asked by a couple of people to just have a little bit of free interactive time to let you ask questions. If you want to ask questions about this, if you want to ask questions about anything else, I'm transparent. So, who has a question? Yes, ma'am.
How did you get called to do the mission, like get involved with all this mission stuff?
I got born. People say, I was born for this. I mean, I was born for this. I honestly believe that Paul said in Galatians, he says, I was separated from my mother's womb for this ministry. I believe that I was called for what I do before. My mother had my sister, and every month for 6 years, I guess not immediately, but for 6 years in between then and the time that I came, every month my mother kept thinking that maybe she would have her second baby, and every month she was disappointed. And finally she got to the point to where that she prayed Hannah's prayer out of the book of 1 Samuel, and said, Lord, if you'll give me a man-child, I'll give him back to you. And I had no choice. She had the deck stacked against me already. And then the next month, she missed her period, and lo and behold, then there I was. So some of my earliest memories are watching the Jungle Book TV programs, black and white, fuzzy, grainy TV, and just being fascinated with, based on Rudyard Kipling, based on other parts of the world, India particularly. And as soon as I got old enough to read, my parents bought me a set of the World Book Encyclopedia. And I used to read all the articles about all the other nations of the world. And in the World Book, if any of you remember those, they would have an article, then they'd have for more information, see, and then I would go do the cross-reference, and at the bottom of that it would say for more information, see, and so I'd go to do the cross-reference, and I would spend hours and hours and hours reading about all the nations of the world, and had no real understanding until later in life that what God was doing, He was preparing me for being able to live among people of different cultures, different nationalities, different religions, and feel an understanding and appreciation for them, and an ability to communicate with them. So basically, yeah, I became a missionary by getting born.
I will bless those who bless you, and I curse those who curse you. How good is that? Like, how can you explain that? I'm not sure.
Well, are you asking for a general?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a specific promise for the people, the Jewish people. We have to be careful about claiming things out of the Bible, out of context. Because there are things that are made specifically for, are statements that are given specifically for particular individuals. And, God gave that to Abraham and his seed. I can't really promise you that it necessarily works for everybody else. Good things do happen to bad people, and bad things do happen to good people. Okay? But God specifically has a plan for the Jewish people, that anybody that rises up against them is going to wind up judged. And we've seen that with nation after nation. Yes, sir.
If you went to Jerusalem on a tour, would it be back if you stayed there? Would it be similar to like if you had a time machine? Would you be able to experience that time?
In some aspects, yes. Of course, Jerusalem is a modern city. I remember when I was teaching and directing the school in Indiana. We used to do study tours every year, so I would go to Israel every year, and so we took lots of people over the course of time. And I remember one guy, when we took him to Israel, he said, "I was surprised to see cars." He just had this idea that people were still riding donkeys and camels, I guess. So, but no, it is a modern city. They have modern highways. They have buses. They have cars. They have trucks. They have stoplights. They have policemen. It is a modern city. But there are a lot of things that are still very traditional. For instance, if you are in Jerusalem on Shabbat, on Saturday, they will close down whole parts of the city. There will not be any cars moving at all in those parts of the cities, because that's the areas where the Orthodox Jews live. And they'll have roadblocks, they'll have barricades. And if you try to cross it, somebody will come out and stone you, because that is still part of their tradition. If you are in a hotel, you pray to God that you're not on the 25th floor, because if you get on the elevator and you want to go down to the first floor to the restaurant, you're going to stop at 24 floors before you get there, because the Jews have a law that you don't work on the Sabbath, and pushing an elevator button is work. And so they have the elevator set to where it stops on every floor, so that somebody can get on and somebody can get off. So you're, all the way down. Now, there is going to be an elevator that is for Gentiles, and that will still have buttons that you can push. And so as a Gentile, you can go around there and you can use that. But then, of course, all the other tourists are also trying to use that same elevator. So you may be in a line trying to get onto that one. If you once you do get down the 26 floors down to the restaurant, and you want coffee, you're going to have coffee that was brewed the day before and kept in a thermos, because they can't light a fire on the Sabbath day. And so they didn't make any fresh coffee that day. So at that point, you just decide, hey, I think I'll join up with Andrew and Delron and not drink any. So you will see some ancient things, and some ancient customs, some ancient practices, especially in Jerusalem and especially on Shabbat. But in the rest of the country, it's a modern country. Yeah.
Is there a care school? I haven't checked.
In Israel?
Yeah.
No, there is not. Not yet. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us one of your favorite experiences on the mission field?
Mm.
Hard or?
Oh my goodness, we only have 6 minutes. I will tell you, one of my favorite places is Nepal, and God gave us a special relationship with Nepal. I've been to Nepal every year for over 25 years. Last couple of years I haven't been able to go back, but we worked there for over 25 years, and we started going when the king granted religious freedom. Before we started going, people were being thrown in jail just for owning a Bible, and there was, absolutely no allowance of Christianity. In 1990, the king wrote a new constitution and granted the people religious freedom. So we started going in right after then, and we started going in with cases full of gospel tracts to take to distribute to the people. Now, I have a friend who was arrested when he went through the border into Nepal because he had a Bible in his suitcase, and they arrested him and threw him in jail. He was 6 months in jail because they found Bibles in his suitcase when he crossed the border. So this was just before 1990. It was in maybe early 1990 or late 1980. Yeah, because he was released when the king signed the new constitution. At any rate, so when we started going in, and we would come in and we would bring cases of literature, and I would take teams. I would have like 6 or 8 or 10 people, and we were always allowed 2 suitcases back then. And so I would give them 1 suitcase that they could pack their own clothes in, and then the next case was gospel literature. And so we would go in with cases full. And so we were stopped at the border, and the guy says, what's all this stuff? And I said, well, it's free Christian literature that we're going to share with your people. And at that point, I reached in and I took out a handful, and I started saying, here, you can have a sample. You can have it, And to probably the same people that arrested my friend 6 months before, I'm freely giving him literature right there at the customs desk. So we get into the country, and we go around and we start distributing literature. We're standing on street corners and stuff, just passing out the literature, and the people are mobbing us to try to get the literature. I mean, just, throngs of people, and the police come up. What are you doing? And I said, I just have this free literature that I'm just giving to the people, and the people are, excited about getting it. And he says, give me that box. And so I gave him a box, and what's he do? He starts going around, passing it out. He says, you can distribute the literature, but there's such a mob of people here that it's blocking the traffic, it's congesting the road, and he started helping me distribute the literature so that we could get the traffic flowing back through the highway again. And this probably the same man who would have hauled me off to jail, the year before. God does all kinds of wonderful things.
Was it English or did you translate?
No, it was in Nepali, in their language. Yeah. 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 All righty. What? Oh, Lord, yes. Like I said, we worked there for over 25 years. And, we started by basically evangelizing, and then we started doing discipleship work. We trained them, what it means to be born again, what it means to be baptized in the Holy Spirit, what it means to live in the fruit, operate in the gifts of the Spirit. And about healing and about deliverance, and layer upon layer, every year a little bit more. And then we eventually bought land, built a college, and sent a guy off to India to go to seminary to get trained to run the college, and so we have a Bible college that we started there, and we have pastors all over. One really neat story. My sister was with me one time, and we were riding on a rickshaw. And the rickshaws in Nepal are, of course, built for Nepali-sized people. Okay, next time I come back, I'll tell you that. Okay, so the rickshaws are built for Nepali-sized people, which are, maybe like 2/3 or 3/4 the size of an American guy. Anyway, so we're sitting in the rickshaw, and we are going through the town. And we're passing out literature as we're riding through, because the streets are congested and people are shoving, and so you can reach out of the rickshaw and say, hey, can I give you this? Anyway, and so, but like I said, we're cramped, and my sister started getting like sciatica, because of the way she was cramped, and so she says, well, here, I'm going to just get out and I'm going to work over here. And I said, well, I'm still going over to the other side of town where we were headed to go. And so anyway, so she gets out, and she has her literature, and she's passing it out on the streets. And the first guy that she hands it to looks at it, and he says, he doesn't say, I've seen this before. He doesn't say, I have this literature. Or he doesn't say, I'm a Christian. The first thing that comes out of his mouth is, I know Delron Shirley. And, here you are in, in Chitwan, in Nepal, thousands of miles away from the rest of the world, and this guy says, I know Delron Shirley. And my sister just about passes out. And she said, well, that's my brother, and that's him over there, And so they run and got me. And what had happened is that guy had been in Kathmandu several years before, when we were doing a literature campaign in Kathmandu, and he happened to be a Christian, but he was in Kathmandu. He was from Chitwan, which is hundreds of miles away from Kathmandu. He was in Kathmandu at a training for his work when he met me on the street, and I gave him a tract, and he says, oh, I'm a believer already, and he says, can I have some of those to take back with me when I go home? And so I gave him a case of tracts with him to go back home, and here it is several years later, and he still remembered the name of the guy who gave him the tracts. And when we got there, he had his own church now. He had his own building, and he was pastoring a church. Yeah, so yeah, God does some great things. All right, God bless. All right, I'll see you again sometime, I hope. Oh, by the way, 3rd-year mission school in Colorado Springs. I think that's where I ought to see all of you next September. All right, so go home, pray about it, listen to God. Really listen to God, and then get an application, and I'll see you in September.